This video is for reading 28, which is entitled The Stigma of Brown Skin and Foreign Names. So consider the author's opening statement that most of what we know about Middle Eastern Americans is based on media stereotypes, especially those related to terrorism. Um, do you think this is true? Consider how much you really know about this group, and then check out the additional sociological background slides about this group that I provided. So oftentimes we use the term, or even this reading uses the term Middle Easterns, but the larger pan-ethnic label is Arab Americans, because Arab Americans covers all nations of origin that at least originally spoke Arabic, right? So they're considered an ethnic group or a pan-ethnic group because of that shared linguistic history. And so if you look at that map, this shows you all of the countries that we consider to be Arabic countries. Middle Eastern is just a subset of those countries. There are certain Arabic countries that are not necessarily considered to be Middle Eastern countries. Now, of course, this reading is a little bit more focused solely on the Middle Eastern kind of sub-ethnic group, because this is the group that is maybe more likely to be associated with that image of terrorism. But because people can't necessarily look at someone and clearly, ascertain their nation of origin, it's worth noted that some of the countries that are not necessarily considered to be Middle Eastern, but are just considered to be Arabic because of some shared phenotypical traits, they are oftentimes sometimes associated with this label. So in terms of some key cultural characteristics, of course, like I said, the language is Arabic. It's a pan-ethnic group, so they're very diverse. Some of that diversity relates to their time of arrival. We got our first wave of Arab Americans actually as early as the 1880s. We also got, waves of people from Arabic countries well into the early 1900s, and really the first wave is considered as going as late as after World War II. A lot of our early Arabic immigrants were, in terms of financial as well as educational capital, they were doing fairly, pretty well, and this definitely impacts how they were initially measured in this country. Because if you go back to the slides from a previous reading where I provided you how we measure race and ethnicity on the census, you'll see that there is no like Arabic racial classification. And that's because, except for a few countries like the Sudan, which tend to be more associated with Africa and therefore African ancestry, a lot of Arabic countries actually are, on the census, they are measured as white. So if you are from these countries, if this is your nation of origin, you are officially categorized as white, even if socially you aren't recognized as such. Kind of similar to the discussion that we had on the previous video about Latinos. Your official classification does not align with your, how you are treated and how you're recognized in your daily interactions and experiences. So what also contributes to their diversity? Lots of different countries, so a lot of different points of origin. Although, of course, today a lot of Arab Americans are, in fact, second generation or greater, meaning they're born here in the United States. And then in terms of religion, oftentimes people will use the word Arab interchangeably with Muslim, but that's not necessarily true. If you ask yourself, are most Muslims Arab? That's actually not the case. You can see there in that pie chart, although about a quarter of them are Muslim, actually in terms of religious, religious denomination, most are Catholic at 35%. And then are most Muslims even Arab? Once again, not the case. Actually, South Asians, make up the largest percentage or proportion of Muslims in America. Um, Followed by African Americans, or African Americans and Arabs are then almost roughly equal at 25 and 26%. So they're both about a quarter of the US Muslim population. Um, and so this just once again shows that although we treat these terms as interchangeable, they're not. So, what are some important things to know about Arab Americans in the United States? They're a fairly small percentage of the American immigrant, as well as native born population. You can see, like, shortly after the 2010 census, they were still less than like 2% of the population. They have high levels of income, occupation, high school and college graduates, like compared to the general population that has about 28% of bachelor degrees. If you look only at Arab Americans, it's 45%. Similar to the high performing Asian minority group, they also, because of that educational investment, they get jobs in the highest area of the job market, which means that their mean level of income is 27% higher than the national average. And so we don't associate them with the model minority stereotype, but in terms of educational as well as kind of financial success, they easily could be. People oftentimes, are less knowledgeable and aware of this population because they tend to form minority enclaves. And so the areas of highest concentration are in 5 states. And with the three kind of most population dense states being California, New York, and surprisingly, Michigan. People don't oftentimes know that. And then post 9/11, they have definitely suffered as a group from stigma and discrimination at both the individual and institutional level, with a lot of that, of course, being related to people's response to the group after 9/11. So to go back to the reading, the reading is going to be focused on how Middle Eastern Americans use humor, education, direct confrontation as a way of responding to people who question their personhood. They note, it is almost human nature that we want to receive attention and be noticed by others, but not all attention is desired or deserved. And they are especially kind of focusing on, this has been the experience of a lot of Middle Eastern Americans post 9/11. And historically, they compare it to what a lot of Japanese Americans experienced in the years leading up to World War II, during World War II, and even immediately after World War II. And so they link this to the concept of accountability. And this isn't maybe how you use accountability in like in your daily, like, non-academic speak. Accountability here is based around this concept of accounts, this idea that we have to offer an account, we have to offer an explanation, some type of statement when people either implicitly or explicitly, in our interactions require us to do so. And so, they are going to be focusing on, how people of Middle Eastern descent, what types of accounts do they offer people when people kind of put them in the position of having to address their Middle Eastern, names and identities. And this reading is, built or based upon, interview data as well as the experience of one of the authors. So they note that, in terms of theoretical framework, they're building upon two other sociologists, Fagan and McKinney, who had previously done research and written a book on the coping mechanisms used by African Americans when they were confronted, like, in their daily interactions with prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination. And they talk about the fact that among their sample of African Americans in the US, they noticed two different types of responses. Some of them were attitudinal coping responses, right, which is basically them just kind of, preparing themselves, their own attitude and their kind of psychological response to these types of encounters. And some of those specific strategies were, always being prepared for discrimination, avoiding the internalization of discrimination and the negative feelings like anger and bitterness that can arise when you experience discrimination, knowing oneself, not letting other people define you in these kind of racialized, stereotypical terms, and then using spirituality or mental withdrawal, as a way of kind of, creating a boundary between who you are and who people are trying to label you as being. And then the other type of response are action oriented responses, right? So then this is where you actually take action in the interaction when you're having this type of experience or encounter. And some of those strategies were verbal confrontation, educating, protesting through formal channels, using humor, and physical withdrawal. So this reading is building on that research, and they're going to be focusing on 4 similar responses used by Middle Eastern Americans when they find themselves in these types of encounters: humorous accounting, educational accounting, confrontational accounting, and passing. I am going the wrong way. All right, so this slide kind of addresses the 4 types of responses. And so for each, and I'm not going to necessarily go over all of this because this is directly from your book, but think about, for humorous accounting, you know, um, there are kind of 2 important points here, I feel like, in addition to the examples they provide of what this looks like, one thing to keep in mind is that the substance of the account is incidental. Like, it doesn't even matter like what you're saying, because the whole point is that you're kind of deliberately trivializing the account. And you're doing that as a way of subtly mocking the need for an account within the encounter, like kind of poking at this idea, like, okay, I'm going to make this out like a joke, because it really is kind of a joke that I even have to explain, justify my Middle Eastern name slash identity with this person in the first place. Educational accounting is much more serious and much more involved, in the sense that, the person is basically having to put themselves in the role of a teacher and take a pedagogical approach where they're basically teaching a person in their interaction about some aspect of their identity or their group's identity that is being misunderstood or misrepresented. Obviously, you have to be selective about which inquiries are worthy of such an account, because not only does this require a lot of the person, right? As the book notes, it can be a considerable chore. But also, if you do this each and every single time, this can hinder your job performance, which your book notes. This could make you, not a fun person to be around in parties and social settings, and so might kind of threaten your, ability to socialize and have fun when you're out. So you have to kind of be very strategic about when you are going to engage in educational accounting. And your reading highlights that this is a particularly common strategy for Muslim women who wear the hijab. People have a lot of misunderstandings and misperceptions about that particular article of clothing, and they can make some, assumptions about what that means to the wearer. And so, the reading just kind of notes that a lot of women, when they're faced with that, they will use the educational accounting to offer, a more, knowledgeable response. Then you have confrontational accounting. Kind of key thing here is when you're calling someone out for, putting you in this situation where your personhood, your identity has been in some way disparaged, demeaned, by engaging in confrontational accounting, the motivation is not to repair the interaction or restore equilibrium. At this point, you don't care if you make people feel bad or put upon or awkward, because usually that this type of encounter has happened because you felt like someone has crossed a line, um, irreparably crossed a line around perceived fairness and equitable treatment. So you have no problem kind of addressing them, putting them in their place, because you don't necessarily care about, maintaining a friendship, or not having to like see them again and have like, awkward encounters. This is a risky approach. Not only can it sometimes perhaps have consequences that are in some ways, worse. When you engage in a confrontational tactic, there is the possibility that the person that you're confronting is going to escalate the situation further. So there is some inherent risk to taking this approach. And then finally, there's passing, and it's worth noting that even when they manipulate their appearance or change their name, which is kind of two of the primary ways in which passing is discussed. This tactic isn't accessible to all Middle Eastern Americans. Some have phenotypes that more clearly align and identify them as being Middle Eastern than others, particularly if they live in settings where there are not necessarily a lot of other racial minorities or ethnic minorities with similar phenotypes where they can kind of blend in, right? So it's not necessarily that they are passing themselves off as white. In some cases they're passing them off as a less stigmatized racial minority. But this does, as the book notes, it comes with complications. Within your group you can be perceived as selling out, and outside of your group, if it comes out later, that what your real ethnic identity is, people might perceive that you engaged in purposeful deception. So this reading ends with just the observation that not all interactions even come with the opportunity for accounting and dialogue. If a person drives by and yells a slur at a Middle Eastern person, they don't even get an opportunity to engage in an account, right? An account is only possible if it's happening within an interaction where such a dialogue, even if it's a confrontational one, a humorous one, an educational one, it has to be occurring in a context where dialogue is even possible. And then the kind of ending kind of observation there that I wanted to highlight: being a member of a stigmatized group means having to explain oneself above and beyond what normal members of society are required to do. So especially keep that in mind in regards to like the educational accounting. This isn't just some fun lighthearted, like, let me teach you about my culture because I'm so proud of my culture. Like, when you feel pressed upon to give this type of educational accounting, it is because you're being pushed in this position of being seen as a other, as being potentially stigmatized and stereotyped against, leaving you kind of limited recourses of action about how to handle this. And so as always, I have some final questions for you to consider. How would you respond to interactions which question or challenge your personhood? Have you ever experienced such a situation? And then if you did, looking back on it, could you code that situation and how you responded in that situation? Could you code or classify your response using some of the discussed strategies from this reading?